G'day and welcome to the first of our reaction videos to some of the videos being put out by our salmon farming opponents. This first one we're going to look at today is called Factories of Living Waste. Before we actually get into the video, we might have a look at an article that appeared in the Mercury yesterday. So in the Mercury yesterday, NOFF actually admitted that they'd sent to the RSPCA a graphic video which exposes the video. Now, interestingly enough, NOFF President Peter George admitted that the footage was derived from international farms, but did have relevance to Tasmania. Well, let's wait and see. And he said that the reason why no Tasmanian footage was included in the video was because of the state's stringent trespass laws. Well, that is interesting. Because while this footage of this poor fish is actually from an overseas fish farm, and so is this, there is some Tasmanian footage actually in this video, which is what we're actually going to be coming back to. So let's just watch it and we'll wait and see how accurate it actually is here. So first they start with the wild Atlantic salmon, and then they cut to, this is a Tasmanian footage as far as I'm aware. That is not. Neither is that. We cut to factories of living waste. Okay, what an absolute emotive name that is. And then we look at some fairly brutal stunning. And then this footage of these really healthy salmon is actually Tasmanian footage. So let's have a look at some of these diseases that they talk about through this video. And deaths are common in fish farming because fish are an animal which release 2,000 eggs per kilo, so that they can ensure that 2 of them actually come back to breed again. So firstly, we're looking here at triploids, and we might just pause the video so I can give you a bit of information about triploids. Because what they say here in triploids is that they're created triploids to make them grow fast. That's not actually true. The reason why they use triploids for some time of the year is because some times of the year, due to natural maturity rates, there would be times of the year where we wouldn't be able to harvest salmon. So by triploids being sterile, that means that we can actually harvest fish all year round. So the triploids don't suffer skeletal deformities. We'll look at a bit further on, they talk about lockjaw. So let's keep watching. So all this bit about their skeletons can't keep up with their muscle growth is wrong. But look at these healthy fish. Tasmanian ones, these ones are not. And these are not necessarily triploids either. So it renders them sterile. These poor fish are not natural. Well, they're just as natural as a seedless watermelon or a seedless grape, which are also triploids. So we'll keep going a little bit further. And yes, we've got some pinhead fish there, which is not good. But again, that's not footage from Tasmania. Neither is that. Or that. Or that. And what do they say here? As many as 1/3 of individuals having deformities, and we are eating. Well, no, we're not. We're not actually eating deformed fish. And look at these healthy Tasmanian fish, because they've ripped this off from one of Tassale's corporate videos. This is a common, reasonably common occurrence with triploids. It's called DJ, drop jaw. And yes, it does affect their feeding. It's not hugely common, but it is common. And some of these fish, if the fact they've actually grown to that same size, you look, it's equivalent size there to the fish that don't have the deformity. So that's not really actually inhibiting them too much. We don't have this. I have never seen one of these fish in my entire career involved with Atlantic salmon. The brain burst, that sounds a little bit disgusting, doesn't it? Now we've got here scoliosis. Okay, yes, this is a quite common deformity. It's a sort of deformity that Richard III had. In humans, we call it hunchback. Those fish in the wild would not survive. The fact that they've been able to grow to that size there means that they are better off in the farm than they would be in the wild, because they simply wouldn't survive. But nevertheless, we can't harvest them because you can't fillet a deformed fish like that, so they are removed and culled. And what we've got here, pesticides and insecticides added to the fish to cause disease. Well, that is rubbish. Firstly, in Australia, we don't have any sea lice, so there's no pesticide treatment. And insecticides might be used in the lunchroom to spray some mozzies if they're there, but that certainly doesn't happen. This is clearly not Tasmania due to the snow, but this is a footage of a Tasmanian fish farm. You would have thought, Peter, and so is this again. This is ripped off blatantly from Tassal's corporate video. Now they're looking at their feed. They're talking about the feed. Oh no, actually now they're talking about the deformities come from vaccination. So are these guys actually now anti-vaxxers, are they? And this is wild salmon. So wild salmon, as I said, an adult female salmon would produce 2,000 eggs per kilo to allow for 2 of those to return. In farmed fish, we generally get around 90% survival. And here we are being fed waste and chemicals. We might actually just pause here because we're also going to look at amoebic gill disease. Now, back at the bit about feed, being fed waste and chemicals. Well, that's a really interesting definition, because if you define things that would normally be thrown away from other processing things, such as the frames from wild fish that are filleted and served up in our fish shops, those frames used to be made into cat food. They're now rendered down, made into fish meal for aquaculture feed. And likewise, feathers from poultry farming. Feathers are keratin protein, just like your fingernails and your hair. You can extract protein from those. So whereas those otherwise would have been thrown away, wasted, they're now being actually used. So rather than call it fed on waste, maybe we could actually say that this is a really good example of a circular economy. So the next thing they cover off in this video is amoebic gill disease. Now, amoebic gill disease is an issue in Tasmania. That is not an example of amoebic gill disease to start with. That is not a Tasmanian fish. That's a fish with a gill deformity, and that's not an amoebic gill disease either, because amoebic gill disease is not apparent outside the fish. You actually have to anaesthetize some fish and then actually physically inspect their gills to see whether the parasite, well, it's not really a parasite. These guys say it's a parasite. The amoeba doesn't want to be in the fish's gills any more than the fish wants the amoeba to be in there. They're just naturally occurring in the environment, and the fish breathe them in as they breathe. They get caught in the gills. They cause a mucus outbreak, just if you breathed in something that you wouldn't like. And so the best way to remove them is to bathe them in fresh water, because the salmon can survive in fresh water for a reasonable amount of time, whereas the amoeba are saltwater species, so they can't survive in fresh water. So they're basically flushed out of the gills. But they now talk about the process of bathing. And this is really interesting, because whereas they say they must be starved, well, that just means you're taking them off their feed for a day. And then they're violently sucked out, propelled in pipes en masse. They smash against each other and the pipes, and they end up lacerated and bruised. I mean, that's simply rubbish. If that happened, then you wouldn't be able to harvest the fish. If we damaged the fish in this process, you simply wouldn't end up with a harvest product. So the fish are actually treated very carefully in the bathing process. So they're just trying to hype up and create a horror story when in fact it's not there. There's more footage here of infectious salmon anemia fish, which doesn't happen in Australia. We do not have that disease in Australia. So this here is pure hype. There's some old footage of Tasmania. That's not Tasmania, although it may be. And yes, we're now looking at pilchard orthomyxovirus. This is an interesting disease, because whereas the anti-salmon activists often say that salmon spread disease into the wild fish, this pilchard orthomyxovirus is an example of the very opposite happening. Okay, this is a disease that doesn't necessarily badly affect pilchards, but is carried by them. Pilchards swim past the salmon cages. Some of the small ones may even swim through the nets, and the salmon actually catch the disease in a transfer from species to species, just like COVID-19. was a disease transferred from pangolins and bats to humans. And this disaster in Macquarie Harbour was happened quite a few years ago now. When look at these lovely healthy fish again. When POMV did kill quite a lot of fish. There's now a vaccine for POMV, so it is able to be treated. So hyping up something that doesn't really affect them anymore is literally just, yeah, it's just rubbish. And the industry glibly dismisses such suffering. Well, the industry doesn't. The industry acts to recover these fish so that they're not affected. And okay, these were very small fish back in when this occurred, and there were other remaining stocks. So that's just a marketing thing. It's not like something they didn't mind that the fish died. They were actually distressed. Now we've got here vaccination. They say 25% of young salmon die from vaccination. From the strength of the vaccine or the brutal intervention. This is just rubbish again. Absolute rubbish. These intelligent animals are also infected by Vibrio. Vibrio is a bacteria that occurs in every single aquaculture operation around the world for every species, freshwater and saltwater. And yeah, you treat a bacterial infection with antibiotics just like we treat bacterial infections with antibiotics. The antibiotics are in the feed. There is a withholding period before the fish are harvested. There's no trace of antibiotics would actually come into the human food chain. They say just how sick are these fish. They used so many tons. Let's just go back to that. I missed that little bit. They said in something in there that they used 31 tons since 2003. Well, that's 20 years ago. And when we're harvesting now about 60 to 70,000 tons per year, 31 tons compared to 60,000 tons in 1 year isn't much, let alone 20 years. I mean, think back in your own life. How many medicines have you consumed in the last 20 years? And compare that to your body weight. I think you'd be surprised. Okay, there, this study as well. So this study was a beat up. They randomly went into some supermarkets, picked some salmon off the out of the counter and tested them. And they didn't actually test them for antibiotic resistance, but they used this to hype the fact that the salmon farming were causing antibiotic resistance, which is again just rubbish. We are becoming resistant to antibiotics because humans use too many of them, not because animals use too many of them. They're saying here that causes a psychological impact to the fish and they just give up and die. Well, I've never known a psychologist to treat a fish before, so maybe they're right. Maybe they have a complex psychology, but I'm thinking that's just a little bit of hype. They simply give up on life and commit suicide. That is rubbish. Excuse me. So they've talked here again about they swimming around in the remains of their friends and worms, as though all the dead fish and the feces fall to the bottom of the pen. All the dead fish are now extracted by automatic suction devices, and the feces falls through to the bottom of the net. And there are worms down there because the worms are there to eat the feces. And we covered off that in one of my earlier toxic videos. Animal welfare researchers call them petri dishes of pathogens, do they? Again, overfed, overhandled, beautiful, healthy salmon. They talk about crowding. Now, before we get to the weed on things, they talk about crowding. The stocking density of Atlantic salmon in Tasmania is between 8 to 10 kilos per cubic metre. So the pens are 99% water and 10% fish. The fish are naturally schooling. They like hanging around together. And they'll swim around in a school around that pen. The pen is not absolutely jam-packed full of fish. Okay, so now they're talking about the nets getting fouled. Well, yes, they do get fouled, but they're cleaned. And ironically, one of the complaints in the Richard Flanagan Toxic book was about net cleaning. So you can't have it both ways, guys. You're either for dirty nets or you're against dirty nets. Let's hang on. There's a bit of poor science here. We'll go back to it. Weed grows on the side of the pens. Leaky bag. It does block the flow of oxygen-rich water. That's why they're cleaned, creating fatally high levels of ammonia and carbon dioxide. I have never known a salmon to ever die from ammonia poisoning and carbon dioxide poisoning in a sea cage. Even with the recirculating aquaculture systems that I used to run in my training centre, where we had stocking densities far higher, and the ammonia levels would sometimes get up to quite not levels that we would have liked, never once did we lose a fish from ammonia. And carbon dioxide, that is simply not an issue in the ocean. It degasses out through wave action. What they do say here is that oxygen levels do fall. They do fall if the nets are not cleaned, and that's why the nets are cleaned. Fecal clouds are like us breathing tear gas. Fish swim in the ocean. Fish shit in the ocean. They naturally evolve to do that. I've just cleaned out my barramundi fish tank, and there was a fair amount of crap sucked up from the gravel. But my barramundi Barry is quite happily swimming around in his fish tank, just as yours probably are in your fish tank too. They're probably not barramundi. This one, 85,000 salmon recently suffocated from a single occurrence of oxygen starvation. They transpose this directly after the fouled nets, but these deaths from oxygen starvation were not caused by fouled deaths. These deaths were in Macquarie Harbour, where there's an anoxic layer at the bottom of the harbour, which is natural, which is why the salmon cages are in the layers above. And what happened was a big ocean storm came in, and a large amount of salt water came in through Hell's Gates and pushed that anoxic layer up into the fish cages. And that's why the fish suffocated. It wasn't because the cages were not clean. And again, that was maybe 5-6 years ago. No event like that has happened again. We've covered off this naturally occurring powdery algae in one of the previous videos. Again, here, all this footage is not Tasmanian. Neither is this. This is Cook Aquaculture, which is in farms used to farm in Washington State, also farms in the east coast of Canada and in Scotland. And this is the company that has recently purchased Tassal. This was soon after they'd taken over an existing farm from another company, which was very poorly maintained, and a large storm destroyed it before they could actually maintain it. This is Hillary Franz, who's leading a campaign to become governor of the state of Washington, and she's trying to get the vote from people who probably like watching that video to vote for governor. Wild salmon, again, not a problem in Tasmania. We don't have wild salmon. We're constantly colliding in their prisons, smashing into each other. They don't smash into each other. They're not stupid. Attacked by seals and seabirds? Yes, if they get into the cages, they are, which is why they're prevented from getting into the cages. Again, horrible footage of deformed salmon, which were not seen in Tasmanian cages. Here's some hype about here's Richard Flanagan, the battery hen of the sea. We've got a video on that one. And the industry lacks into a law itself is saying that there's no regulation. Now look, there's some Tasmanian footage, Peter. There's some more Tasmanian footage, but no, you didn't actually see it. And this is interesting, by trying to imply that the workers are affected. Well, divers used to have to go and extract morts, which are dead fish, from the cages, but now they're all sucked up by remote things. And this is not in Tasmania. It's definitely not in Tasmania, and that's quite some years ago. And then this bit, the dead fish, let's just go back so you can read that subtitle. The fish are tossed into bins for human consumption or pet food. Morts, dead fish, are never, ever used for human consumption. Some dead fish, the morts will be taken to rendering plants and rendered round into fish oil and fish meal, which are not fed to salmon because of the possibility of a mad salmon disease. And they're fed to other aquaculture species, and they're also used for pet food. But don't worry, you are never ever going to be eating fish that has died of disease or any other means other than being harvested in the humane way. Atlantic salmon are treated more cruelly than other farmed features. Well, I've been watching some ads on TV about pigs, and that looks a fair bit crueler than salmon are treated. Although I happen to like eating pork. Dying in excruciating pain, struggling in vain. That's also not true. Okay, it's a very humane way. They're sucked up in a stream of water. They swim with the flow of the water, so they actually swim through those pipes, and then they swim naturally until they get to the stunners. They don't know what they don't struggle to go backwards. They go with the flow. Salmon swim upstream. This is that's not a common thing. Okay? Certainly not at all in Tasmania. Excuse me. And now, cleverly, watch how they do here. They pan through and then they fade the colour out. That's sort of a subtle hint about the artificial colouring astaxanthin, which is not artificial, it's a natural um, antioxidant. And finally, they cover off with some Tasmanian salmon transposed against some international salmon harvesting process to tell you quite a false story about what happens in Tasmanian aquaculture operations. So that's basically the video from NOFF. It's absolute rubbish. I'm hoping all my reaction videos aren't going to have to be so constant as this one, but yeah, hope you enjoyed that. And if you've got any questions, drop a question into the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.